Maybe don't mention your little coffee shop job to Marcus's family. We want to make a good impression. Mom, I hadn't expected my family's shame in me to be spelled out so clearly in Times New Roman font. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter like an accusation, cream cardstock with elegant calligraphy announcing the engagement of Isabella Montgomery and Marcus Wellington III. Even the name screamed old money and social expectations. But it wasn't the gilded lettering or the embossed roses that made my stomach twist. It was that handwritten note paper-clipped to the back, my mother's perfect penmanship delivering a blow that felt more personal than any family argument we'd ever had. I read it again, each word cutting deeper. Maybe don't mention your little coffee shop job to Marcus's family. We want to make a good impression. Mom, my little coffee shop job. The phrase sat in my mouth like bitter grounds, as if managing operations for 3 thriving artisanal coffee locations, handling complex supply chain logistics across 2 states, and developing sustainable sourcing partnerships with farmers in Guatemala and Ethiopia was something to be ashamed of. As if the 60-hour weeks I'd been putting in, the inventory systems I'd revolutionized, and the profit margins I'd improved by 37% were just playing dress-up in the business world. I set the invitation down and walked to my apartment window, looking out at the Seattle skyline where glass towers reflected the gray morning light. My reflection stared back from the window. Riley Park, 25 years old, MBA from University of Washington, and apparently the family embarrassment. The woman who'd gone from golden child to cautionary tale in the span of 6 months. The irony wasn't lost on me. This time last year, I'd been the success story at every family gathering. Fresh out of business school with a 3.9 GPA, summa cum laude, class representative, the whole package. My parents had practically glowed when I announced my acceptance to Morrison & Associates, the same prestigious consulting firm where my older brother Jake had been climbing the corporate ladder for 3 years. Finally, both our children at Morrison, my father had said, raising his wine glass at my graduation dinner. The Park family tradition continues. Quote, ... My mother had beamed, already planning which country club events she'd bring me to, which social circles would hear about her daughter's 6-figure starting salary. My younger sister Emma had pouted slightly, not because she wasn't proud of me, but because it meant another year of being the baby, while Jake and I collected all the career accolades. I'd been on top of the world. MBA in hand, signing bonus deposited, apartment lease signed for a high-rise downtown. I'd even bought my first real business wardrobe, tailored blazers and designer heels that made me feel like I could conquer boardrooms and close million-dollar deals. Then, 2 weeks before my start date, the email arrived. Short, clinical, devastating. Dear Ms. Park, due to unexpected changes in our business needs and client requirements, we must regretfully withdraw our offer of employment. We apologize for any inconvenience this may cause and wish you the best in your future endeavors. Sincerely, Human Resources Department. No phone call, no explanation, no opportunity to ask questions or understand what had gone wrong. Just a form letter that destroyed everything I'd built my future around. I'd been devastated, calling the HR department repeatedly, only to be told the decision was final and they couldn't provide additional details. Jake had been just as confused, promising to ask around discreetly, but weeks passed with no answers. The corporate world had suddenly turned its back on me, and I couldn't understand why. The student loan payments didn't care about my confusion, though. Neither did my rent or the credit card bills from my new professional wardrobe. I had exactly 6 weeks of savings before I'd be in serious financial trouble. That's when I found the listing for Brew and Bean Coffee Company, a small, struggling chain of 3 locations that desperately needed someone to streamline operations and improve profitability. The salary was less than half what Morrison had offered, but it was honest work, and Mrs. Chen, the owner, seemed genuinely relieved to find someone with my qualifications willing to take the position. You're overqualified for this, she'd said during my interview, studying my resume with kind but puzzled eyes. Are you sure this is what you want? I wasn't sure of anything anymore, but I needed the job. I believe in the potential of small businesses, I'd said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Sometimes the best opportunities come in unexpected packages. Mrs. Chen had smiled at that, something warm and knowing in her expression. Yes, she'd said quietly, sometimes they do. Within my first month, I understood why the previous manager had quit. The inventory system was a disaster, vendor relationships were strained, and 2 of the 3 locations were hemorrhaging money. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt energized. This wasn't just a job, it was a puzzle, and I'd always been good at solving puzzles. I spent my first 2 weeks just observing. I watched the morning rush, tracked customer patterns, analyzed sales data going back 2 years. I visited our suppliers, talked to the baristas, even spent shifts behind the counter learning the rhythm of service. What I discovered was a business with incredible potential being strangled by inefficiency. The coffee was exceptional. Mrs. Chen had relationships with some of the most ethical and sustainable farms I'd ever encountered. The locations were perfectly positioned in high-traffic areas. The staff was dedicated but undertrained. Everything needed was there. It just needed someone to connect the dots. I started small. I restructured the inventory system, implementing just-in-time ordering that reduced waste by 40%. I renegotiated contracts with suppliers, leveraging our multi-location status to get better pricing. I developed training programs for the staff, teaching them not just how to make drinks, but how to understand the story behind each bean, each brewing method. The changes were dramatic. Within 3 months, all 3 locations were profitable. Within 4 months, we had a waiting list of potential new locations wanting to franchise. Mrs. Chen started getting calls from industry publications wanting to interview her about the miraculous turnaround of her coffee chain. But my family didn't see any of that. All they saw was their MBA daughter working in food service. The first time I tried to explain what I was actually doing, we were at Sunday dinner at my parents' house in Bellevue. The dining room was elegant as always, with my mother's collection of Chinese porcelain displayed in built-in cabinets and fresh flowers from their garden centerpiece on the mahogany table. "So Riley," my father had said, cutting into his perfectly prepared salmon, "when do you think you'll start looking for a real job again?" I'd set down my fork carefully. "This is a real job, Dad. I'm managing operations for a growing business. We've increased profitability by—" "It's a coffee shop," Emma had interrupted, not unkindly, but with the dismissive tone she'd perfected as a psychology major. "I mean, it's nice that you're helping out, but you have an MBA. Don't you want to use your education?" Jake had nodded in agreement. "Morrison's always hiring. I could put in another word for you. Whatever happened before, I'm sure we could work around it." "I don't need you to put in a word," I'd said, hearing my voice get sharper than I intended. "I'm building something important at Brew & Bean. We're creating sustainable supply chains, supporting small farmers, developing community spaces." "Honey," my mother had said, reaching over to pat my hand, "we know you're making the best of a difficult situation. But let's be realistic. Working in coffee service isn't exactly what we had in mind when we supported you through business school." That's when my father had said it. "Dead-end job, Riley. When are you going to get serious about your career?" The conversation had moved on, but those words had stuck with me. Dead-end job. As if providing people with ethically sourced coffee and creating community spaces was somehow less valuable than helping corporations optimize their tax structures or restructure their workforces. But the worst part was Emma's engagement party 2 months later. She'd just gotten engaged to David, a finance guy who worked downtown and drove a Tesla, and said things like synergistic market solutions in casual conversation. The party was at my parents' house, all their friends and David's family filling the living room and spilling out onto the back patio. I'd been standing by the kitchen island, trying to enjoy my champagne and be supportive, when I overheard Mrs. Wellington, David's mother, asking my mother about her children. "Oh, we're so proud," my mother had gushed. "Jake is doing wonderfully at Morrison & Associates. He's in line for senior associate this year. And Emma is finishing her psychology degree, planning to go into counseling work. Such important work, helping people." "And your other daughter?" Mrs. Wellington had asked politely. There had been a pause, just long enough for me to feel the weight of my mother's embarrassment. "Riley is finding her way. She's working in the service industry right now, but she has her MBA. I'm sure she'll figure things out soon." Quote, ... The service industry. Finding her way. The casual dismissal had hit harder than any direct insult could have. Later that night, Emma had found me on the back porch, where I'd escaped to get some air. "You okay?" she'd asked, sitting down beside me on the porch swing. Your fiancé's mother thinks I'm a barista, I'd said, staring out at the perfectly manicured garden. Emma had laughed, not meanly, but with that younger sister lightness that made everything seem simpler than it was. Well, aren't you? I mean, sort of. I manage 3 locations, Em. I handle supply chains across multiple countries. I've increased profitability by 37% in 6 months. I know, she'd said, patting my shoulder. But you have to admit, when you tell people you work at a coffee shop, that's what they're going to think. At least I won't have to smell like coffee beans when I marry David next year. She'd meant it as a joke, but it had stung. Even my little sister, who'd always looked up to me, saw my work as something to be embarrassed about. Jake had been different, but not better. A few weeks after Emma's party, he'd taken me to lunch at one of those expensive downtown places where everyone wore suits and talked in low, serious voices about quarterly projections. Look, Rye, he'd said, cutting into his $40 steak. I know you're trying to make the best of things, but this coffee shop gig can't be permanent. You're wasting your potential. I'm not wasting anything, I'd said. I'm building something meaningful. He'd given me that look, the big brother look that said he knew better than I did about my own life. Meaningful doesn't pay the bills. And it's not going to look good on your resume when you're ready to get back into real business. Real business. As if creating sustainable supply chains and building community spaces wasn't real enough. Besides, he'd continued, Mom and Dad are worried. They invested a lot in your education, and they want to see you succeed. I am succeeding, I'd said. But even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if anyone would ever see it that way. The months that followed had been a strange combination of professional triumph and personal isolation. At work, I was thriving. Mrs. Chen had started asking my opinion on expansion plans, vendor negotiations, even family business decisions. The staff respected me, customers were happy, and the numbers kept improving. But at family gatherings, I felt like I was wearing a scarlet letter. The daughter who'd fallen from grace. The one with potential, who was wasting it on something that didn't matter. That's why the note on Isabella's engagement invitation had hit so hard. Not just because of what it said, but because of what it represented. My family was so ashamed of my work that they'd rather I lie about it than tell the truth. But they didn't know what I'd discovered 3 weeks ago. They didn't know about the email that had changed everything. I walked back to the kitchen counter and picked up my phone, scrolling to the message that I'd read probably 50 times since it arrived. Ms. Park, I hope this email finds you well. My name is Alexander Chen, CEO of Chen Global Enterprises. I believe we need to discuss your future with our company, as well as your exceptional work with my mother's coffee business. Please arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience. I think you'll find our conversation mutually beneficial. Best regards, Alexander Chen. Alexander Chen. I'd stared at that name for a full 5 minutes when the email first arrived, my brain struggling to connect the dots. Chen Global Enterprises was one of the largest sustainable business conglomerates in the Pacific Northwest, with holdings in renewable energy, ethical manufacturing, sustainable agriculture, and a dozen other industries. Alexander Chen wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of billionaire who appeared on Forbes covers, gave TED Talks about corporate responsibility, and had regular coffee meetings with senators and governors. And apparently Mrs. Chen at my dead-end coffee shop was his mother. I'd done some research after receiving the email, staying up until 2 a.m. diving into articles about Chen Global Enterprises. What I'd learned had blown my mind. The company's business model was exactly what I'd been trying to implement at Brew and Bean on a small scale. Sustainable supply chains, ethical partnerships, community investment, long-term thinking over short-term profits. Every article one read mentioned Alexander Chen's commitment to discovering and developing talent, his belief that the best business minds weren't always found in traditional corporate settings. There were stories about him finding his head of renewable energy working as a park ranger, his director of sustainable agriculture running a small organic farm, his chief technology officer building apps from her garage. But more than that, there were mentions of his mother. Brief references to how his business philosophy had been shaped by watching her run small businesses, how his commitment to ethical sourcing came from growing up around her work with coffee farmers, how his understanding of community development started with seeing her create gathering spaces in urban neighborhoods. Mrs. Chen, the quiet, kind woman who made the best Vietnamese coffee I'd ever tasted, who knew every regular customer's name and asked about their families, who had trusted me with her business when no one else would, was the mother of one of the most influential businessmen in the country. And I'd been working for her for 6 months without having any idea. The meeting was scheduled for tomorrow. Alexander Chen was flying in from Portland specifically to meet with me, according to his assistant's follow-up email. We were meeting at the flagship Brew and Bean location at 2 p.m. during the afternoon lull, when Mrs. Chen usually did her bookkeeping in the back office. I had no idea what to expect. The email had been professional but vague, mentioning my exceptional work, but not specifying what kind of future we'd be discussing. Part of me wondered if this was some kind of test, if Mrs. Chen had been reporting on my work to her son all along, but another part of me, the part that had spent months feeling like a failure, like someone who'd lost her way, felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year. Hope. I picked up Isabella's invitation again, reading my mother's note one more time. Maybe don't mention your little coffee shop job to Marcus's family. We want to make a good impression. I thought about the engagement party scheduled for this Saturday. The same extended family would be there. The same social expectations. The same polite inquiries about when I was going to get my life together. Isabella would be glowing in some designer dress. Marcus would be charming everyone with stories about his venture capital firm. And I would be the cousin who'd somehow ended up in food service despite her expensive education. Or would I? I opened my laptop and typed a response to the RSVP. Looking forward to celebrating with you and Marcus. Can't wait to catch up with everyone. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Tomorrow, I would meet with Alexander Chen. Tomorrow, I would find out what my future actually looked like. And Saturday, I would go to that engagement party, not as the family disappointment, but as someone who finally understood that sometimes the most valuable opportunities come disguised as setbacks. My family wanted to hide my job? Perfect. Let them. Because I had a feeling that by Saturday night, there would be nothing left to hide. The call from Morrison and Associates had come on a Tuesday afternoon in March, exactly 14 days before I was supposed to start my dream job. I remember the date because I'd been crossing off days on my calendar like a kid waiting for Christmas. Each X bringing me closer to the life I'd worked so hard to build. I was in my apartment, still living in the cramped studio near campus that I'd planned to leave as soon as my first paycheck cleared. Boxes were already packed and labeled, ready for the move to the downtown high-rise where successful consultants lived. I'd even bought champagne to celebrate my first day, a bottle of Dom Perignon that cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a month, but I'd felt justified in the splurge. After all, I was about to start making 6 figures. Riley Park? The voice on the phone was crisp, professional, completely impersonal. Yes, this is Riley, I'd said, balancing the phone between my ear and shoulder while I taped up another box of textbooks. This is Jennifer from Human Resources at Morrison and Associates. I'm calling regarding your employment offer. My heart had done a little skip of excitement. Maybe they were calling to discuss start date logistics, or to tell me about orientation details. Great! I'm so excited to get started. Do you need any additional paperwork from me? There had been a pause, long enough for my excitement to curdle into something colder. Ms. Park, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Due to unexpected changes in our business needs and client requirements, we must regretfully withdraw our offer of employment. The tape dispenser had slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor. I'm sorry, what? We apologize for any inconvenience this may cause and wish you the best in your future endeavors. Wait, I'd said, my voice getting higher, more desperate. I don't understand. What changed? Is this about my references? My background check? I can explain anything that... The decision is final, Ms. Park. You should receive a formal email within the hour. Again, we apologize for any inconvenience. And then she'd hung up. Just like that. No explanation, no discussion, no opportunity to ask questions or understand what had gone wrong. I'd stared at my phone for a full minute, waiting for it to ring again, waiting for someone to tell me this was a mistake, a miscommunication, anything other than what it appeared to be. The email had arrived 47 minutes later, exactly as promised. Short, clinical, devastating. Dear Ms. Park, due to unexpected changes in our business needs and client requirements, we must regretfully withdraw our offer of employment. We apologize for any inconvenience this may cause and wish you the best in your future endeavors. Sincerely, Human Resources Department. I'd read it 17 times, looking for clues for some hidden meaning that might explain what had happened. But there was nothing. Just corporate speak and legal protection, wrapped up in a form letter that felt like it had been designed specifically to tell you nothing while destroying everything. The first call I had made was to Jake. He'd been at Morrison for 3 years by then, working his way up from junior associate to senior associate, and he knew the system better than anyone. That's insane, he'd said when I read him the email. I've never heard of them rescinding an offer this close to start date. Are you sure you didn't miss something? Some deadline or requirement? I've been checking my email obsessively for weeks, I'd said, pacing around my tiny apartment like a caged animal. I turned in every piece of paperwork early. My background check came back clean. My references were stellar. I don't understand what could have changed. Jake had promised to ask around discreetly to see if anyone knew what had happened. But days passed, then weeks, and he came back with nothing. It's weird, he'd admitted. Usually when something like this happens, there's gossip. People talk. But no one seems to know anything about your situation. It's like it never happened. That had been almost worse than the rejection itself. The idea that my entire future had been erased so quietly, so efficiently, that it hadn't even registered as significant enough for office gossip. My parents had been supportive at first. These things happen in the corporate world, my father had said, using his most reassuring voice. You're talented and well-educated. Something else will come along. My mother had been more practical. Start applying to other firms immediately. Don't let this derail your timeline. But as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, their support had gradually shifted to concern, then frustration, then something that felt uncomfortably close to disappointment. You need to lower your standards, my mother had said during one particularly brutal family dinner in April. You're being too picky. Not every job is going to be Morrison and Associates. I'm not being picky, I'd protested. I'm sending out dozens of applications every week. I'm networking. I'm following up. I'm doing everything right. But something's wrong. It's like there's some invisible barrier keeping me out. My father had given me that look, the one that said he thought I was making excuses. Maybe the problem isn't invisible, Riley. Maybe you need to take a hard look at how you're presenting yourself. Your interview skills, your resume, your attitude. My attitude. As if wanting to understand why my career had been derailed before it even started was somehow a character flaw. The job search had been a nightmare that stretched on for months. I'd applied to every consulting firm in Seattle, Deloitte, McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, smaller boutique firms, even some mid-tier companies that I would have considered beneath me 6 months earlier. Then I'd expanded to Portland, then to firms across the entire Pacific Northwest. I'd leveraged every connection from business school, reaching out to professors who'd written my recommendations, classmates who'd landed positions at other firms, alumni network contacts who'd seemed so willing to help when I was still riding high on my Morrison offer. I'd attended networking events where I smiled until my face hurt and handed out business cards like they were lottery tickets, making small talk about market trends and industry challenges while internally screaming about the unfairness of it all. Nothing. Radio silence from most places, polite rejections from others. A few interviews that seemed to go well, where I'd walk out feeling confident and optimistic, only to receive emails days later thanking me for my time, but informing me they'd decided to go with other candidates who were a better fit for the role. A better fit. What did that even mean? I had the right education, the right experience, the right skills. I could analyze complex business problems, develop strategic solutions, present findings to senior executives. I'd graduated summa cum laude, for God's sake. What more did they want? By May, I was starting to panic. My savings were dwindling faster than I'd anticipated. Turns out, When you're expecting to start a high-paying job, you don't budget as carefully for an extended period of unemployment. My student loan payments were looming like a financial guillotine, and my parents' disappointment was becoming harder to ignore with each passing family dinner. The apartment I'd planned to rent downtown had gone to someone else, of course. The person I was supposed to be, successful consultant, financial independence, adult who had her life together, was slipping away day by day, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Someone who checked her email compulsively, who lay awake at night wondering what was wrong with her, who was starting to believe that maybe she'd been reaching too high all along. The champagne I'd bought to celebrate my first day at Morrison had been drunk during a particularly dark evening in late May, when I'd wondered if my entire career was over before it had even begun. I'd sat on my tiny balcony, looking out at the Seattle skyline where I'd planned to work, and tried to figure out where everything had gone wrong. That's when Emma had made the comment that crystallized everything I was feeling. We'd been at Sunday dinner, and I'd been quieter than usual, picking at my food while everyone else discussed their weeks. Emma was full of stories about her psychology classes, Jake was talking about some big case he was working on, and my parents were glowing with pride at their successful children. You know, Emma had said, twirling pasta around her fork with the casual confidence of someone whose biggest worry was choosing between electives, maybe this is actually a good thing. Maybe the universe is telling you that corporate consulting isn't right for you. I'd looked up sharply. What's that supposed to mean? I just mean, you've always been kind of intense about work stuff. Maybe this is a chance to find something that makes you happier. Something more creative or meaningful or whatever. The words had hit me like a slap. Consulting is meaningful. I worked my ass off for that MBA so I could help businesses solve complex problems, improve their operations, create value. Okay, Emma had said, holding up her hands like I was being unreasonable. I didn't mean to upset you. I just thought maybe this could be an opportunity to explore other options. Quote, ... But what she'd really meant, what they'd all meant, was that maybe I wasn't cut out for the corporate world after all. Maybe I'd been reaching too high, aiming for something beyond my actual capabilities. Maybe the rejection from Morrison and Associates wasn't a fluke or a mistake. Maybe it was the market telling me I didn't belong. The worst part was that a small voice in my head was starting to agree with them. After months of rejections and radio silence, I was beginning to wonder if there was something fundamentally wrong with me, some flaw that everyone could see except me. By June, I was desperate enough to take anything. That's when I'd seen the listing for Brew and Bean Coffee Company, buried on page 3 of a job search website between a receptionist position and a part-time dog walker ad. Operations manager needed for small but growing coffee chain. Business degree preferred. Competitive salary and growth opportunities. The salary listed was less than half what Morrison had offered, but it was honest work, and I was running out of options. My savings account was down to 3 digits, and my parents' concerned questions about my job search were becoming daily occurrences. I'd applied that same day, spending hours crafting a cover letter that somehow made managing coffee shops sound like a natural career progression for someone with an MBA. Mrs. Chen had called me within hours, which should have been my first clue that this wasn't a typical business situation. Ms. Park, this is Linda Chen from Brew and Bean Coffee. I received your application for our operations manager position. Yes, thank you for calling so quickly, I'd said, trying to inject enthusiasm into my voice despite my growing desperation. I have to ask, she'd said, and I could hear the curiosity in her voice. Why is someone with your qualifications interested in a position like this? It was the question I'd been dreading, the one that forced me to admit how far I'd fallen from my original plans. I'd debated how much honesty to offer, but something about her tone made me want to tell the truth. I had a job lined up at a consulting firm, but the offer was rescinded at the last minute. I've been looking for something in my field for months, but I'd shrugged, even though she couldn't see me. I need work, and I believe in the potential of small businesses. Mrs. Chen had been quiet for a moment. Consulting can be challenging. Lots of politics, lots of pressure to fit into certain molds. Sometimes the most talented people find that traditional corporate environments don't suit them. Maybe, I'd said, though part of me still believed that I belonged in those corporate environments, that I just needed to find the right fit. Would you be available for an interview tomorrow afternoon? The interview had taken place at the original Bruin Bean location, a cozy space in Capitol Hill with exposed brick walls, mismatched furniture, and the kind of warm, lived-in atmosphere that made you want to stay for hours. It was the opposite of the sterile corporate offices where I'd been interviewing for months, and I'd found myself relaxing despite my nervousness. Mrs. Chen was probably in her early 60s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. She'd been wearing a simple cardigan and jeans, looking more like someone's favorite aunt than a business owner, but there was something about her presence that commanded respect. "Your resume is impressive," she'd said, studying the papers in front of her. "MBA from UW, excellent grades, strong recommendations from professors. Can I ask why you're interested in a position like this?" The question again. I'd taken a breath and decided to go with honesty. I had a job lined up at Morrison and Associates, but the offer was rescinded 2 weeks before my start date. I've been looking for something in my field for months, but I gestured around the coffee shop. I need work, and I believe in the potential of small businesses. Sometimes the most innovative solutions come from places you don't expect. Mrs. Chen had nodded slowly. "Morrison and Associates. I know that firm. Very prestigious, very competitive. Also very traditional in their thinking. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't." There had been something in her tone, a knowing quality that made me think she understood more about corporate politics than her casual appearance suggested. "Tell me," Mrs. Chen had continued, "what do you see when you look at this place?" I'd glanced around the coffee shop, automatically shifting into analysis mode. "I see a business with strong fundamentals that's probably struggling with operational efficiency. Great location, good product, loyal customer base, but likely issues with inventory management, vendor relationships, maybe staff training and retention." Mrs. Chen had smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from a potential employer in months. "Very good. And what would you do about those issues?" That's when I'd really come alive. For the next 20 minutes, I'd outlined a preliminary operational strategy, discussing everything from supply chain optimization to customer retention programs. I'd talked about implementing just-in-time inventory systems, renegotiating vendor contracts, developing staff training programs that would improve both efficiency and customer experience. Mrs. Chen had listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed she understood the complexities of business operations better than I'd initially assumed. By the time I finished, she was nodding with what looked like genuine enthusiasm. "When can you start?" she'd asked. "Immediately," I'd said, probably too quickly. "Good. Monday morning? 8 o'clock. We have a lot of work to do." The first day had been overwhelming in the best possible way. The previous manager had quit with 2 weeks' notice, leaving behind a chaos of spreadsheets, vendor contracts, and staff schedules that made no logical sense. The inventory system was tracked on paper, vendor relationships were strained because of late payments and poor communication, and 2 of the 3 locations were losing money every month. But instead of feeling defeated, I'd felt energized for the first time in months. This wasn't just a job, it was a puzzle, and I'd always been good at solving puzzles. I'd started by spending a week just observing, taking notes, asking questions. I'd worked shifts at each location, learning the rhythm of service, understanding the customer base, identifying the pain points that were costing time and money. I'd met with vendors, reviewed contracts, analyzed sales data going back 2 years. What I'd discovered was a business with incredible potential being strangled by inefficiency and neglect. The coffee was exceptional. Mrs. Chen had relationships with some of the most ethical and sustainable farms I'd ever encountered. The locations were perfectly positioned in high-traffic areas with loyal customer bases who genuinely cared about the business. The staff was dedicated but undertrained, working harder than they needed to because proper systems weren't in place to support them. Everything needed was there. It just needed someone to connect the dots. I'd started with the inventory system, implementing just-in-time ordering that reduced waste and improved cash flow. Then I'd renegotiated contracts with suppliers, leveraging our multi-location status to get better pricing while maintaining Mrs. Chen's commitment to ethical sourcing. I'd developed training programs for staff, not just on how to make drinks, but on how to understand the story behind each bean, each brewing method, each farmer relationship. The changes had been dramatic. Within 6 weeks, waste was down 40%. Within 2 months, all 3 locations were showing improved margins. Within 3 months, we were profitable across the board. And Mrs. Chen was getting calls from potential investors interested in franchise opportunities. But my family didn't see any of that. All they saw was their MBA daughter working in food service. The first family dinner after I'd started at Brew & Bean had been excruciating. I'd been excited to share what I was working on, the challenges I was solving, the impact I was making. But every time I mentioned the coffee shop, I could see their expressions shift to something between pity and embarrassment. "So you're basically a manager at a restaurant?" My father had asked. "It's not a restaurant. It's a coffee company with multiple locations. I'm handling operations across 3 sites, managing supply chains, developing—" "It's temporary," my mother had interrupted, more to herself than to me. "You're just regrouping." "Actually, I think I might want to stay," I'd said. "The work is challenging, and I'm making a real impact. Mrs. Chen is talking about expansion, possibly franchising." "Riley," my father had said, using the tone he'd used when I was a child making unrealistic career plans. "You have an MBA. You're meant for bigger things than managing a coffee shop." "This isn't just managing a coffee shop," I'd protested. "I'm handling supply chain logistics across multiple states, developing sustainable sourcing partnerships, implementing operational systems that could be scaled to dozens of locations." "Honey," my mother had said gently, "we know you're making the best of a difficult situation. But let's be realistic about what this is." That's when my father had said it. "Dead-end job, Riley. When are you going to get serious about your career?" The words had hit me like a physical blow. Dead-end job. As if everything I was learning, everything I was building, everything I was contributing, was somehow less valuable because it wasn't happening in a glass tower with a corporate logo. But the worst part had been the conversation I'd overheard at Emma's engagement party 2 months later. I'd been in the kitchen, refilling my wine glass and trying to avoid the social minefield of extended family questions about my career, when I'd heard Mrs. Wellington asking my mother about her children. "Oh, we're so proud," my mother had gushed. "Jake is doing wonderfully at Morrison & Associates. He's in line for senior associate this year. And Emma is finishing her psychology degree, planning to go into counseling work. Such important work, helping people." "And your other daughter?" Mrs. Wellington had asked politely. The pause that followed had felt like an eternity. "Riley is finding her way. She's working in the service industry right now, but she has her MBA. I'm sure she'll figure things out soon." Finding her way. Service industry. The casual dismissal had been more devastating than any direct criticism could have been. I'd stood there in the kitchen, holding my wine glass and feeling like I was disappearing, becoming invisible even to my own mother. Later that night, I'd called Jake, needing someone to understand what I was going through. "Look, Rye," he'd said, and I could hear the careful patience in his voice. "I get that you're trying to make the best of things, but Mom and Dad have a point. You're overqualified for what you're doing. You're wasting your potential." "I'm not wasting anything," I'd said. "I'm building something meaningful." "Meaningful doesn't pay the bills," he'd replied. "And it's not going to look good on your resume when you're ready to get back into real business." Real business. There it was again, the assumption that what I was doing wasn't real enough, wasn't important enough, wasn't worthy of the education they'd helped pay for. "Besides," Jake had continued, "Mom and Dad invested a lot in your education. They want to see you succeed." "I am succeeding," I'd said, but even as the words left my mouth, I'd wondered if anyone would ever see it that way. The months that followed had been a strange combination of professional triumph and personal isolation. At work, I was thriving. Mrs. Chen had started asking my opinion on expansion plans, vendor negotiations, even personal business decisions. The staff respected me, customers recognized me, and the numbers kept improving every month. But at family gatherings, I felt like I was wearing a scarlet letter. The daughter who'd fallen from grace. The one with potential who was wasting it on something that didn't matter. And tomorrow I would find out exactly what Alexander Chen thought about the work his dead-end job daughter had been doing with his mother's business. My alarm went off at 5:30 a.m., the same time it had for the past 6 months. The early morning routine had become my sanctuary, the only time of day when I could exist without defending my choices or explaining my worth to anyone. I padded to my kitchen in the pre-dawn darkness, the Seattle skyline still twinkling outside my window. My apartment was modest, nothing like the downtown high-rise I'd planned to move into when I thought my life was heading in a different direction. But it was mine, paid for with money I'd earned through work that mattered, even if my family couldn't see it. The coffee I brewed was from Brew & Bean's newest blend, a collaboration with a women's cooperative in Honduras that I'd helped negotiate. As I waited for it to steep, I checked my phone for any urgent messages from the 3 locations. Being operations manager meant being on call, ready to solve problems before most people were even awake. This morning, there was a text from Marcus, the manager at our Capitol Hill location. Espresso machine making weird noise again. Can you stop by before opening? I smiled despite myself. 6 months ago, equipment failures would have meant panic, calling expensive repair services, losing hours of revenue. Now, I knew our machines well enough to diagnose most problems myself, and I'd built relationships with reliable, affordable repair technicians who understood our commitment to minimal downtime. I threw on jeans and a Brew & Bean hoodie, the unofficial uniform I'd adopted that made me look more like a barista than a business operations manager with an MBA. But I'd learned to find freedom in that anonymity. No one at the coffee shops looked at me with pity or disappointment. They saw someone who solved problems, who made their work easier, who respected what they did. The drive to Capitol Hill took 15 minutes through empty streets. Seattle in the early morning was a different city. Quieter, more honest, without the daytime performance of success and ambition that made me feel like such a failure at family gatherings. Marcus was waiting outside when I arrived, keys jingling nervously. He was 23, a recent college graduate with a literature degree who'd taken the manager job while figuring out his next move. 6 months ago, I might have seen him as a cautionary tale. Now, I recognized a kindred spirit, someone whose current job didn't define their worth or potential. "Thanks for coming so early," he said, unlocking the door. "I know it's a pain, but we've got the morning rush in 2 hours and—" "It's not a pain," I said, meaning it. "This is what I'm here for." The espresso machine was indeed making a concerning grinding noise, but after 15 minutes of troubleshooting, I identified the problem, a worn-out burr grinder that needed replacement. It was the kind of issue that would have cost the previous management hundreds in emergency repair fees, but I'd already negotiated a maintenance contract that covered exactly this situation. "How did you know how to fix that?" Marcus asked, watching me clean the machine with practiced efficiency. "YouTube University," I said, only half joking. When you're responsible for keeping 3 locations running smoothly, you learn to diagnose problems fast. What I didn't tell him was that I'd spent countless evenings watching technical videos, reading equipment manuals, learning the mechanical intricacies of commercial coffee machines. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary, and I discovered I had a talent for understanding complex systems and finding efficient solutions. By 6:45, the Capitol Hill location was ready for opening. The morning crew arrived: Sarah, a graduate student in environmental science, and Tom, a musician who worked mornings to support his band. They greeted me with genuine warmth, asking about my weekend, sharing stories about difficult customers or successful experiments with latte art. This was the part of my job that my family would never understand. These weren't just employees. They were partners in building something meaningful. Sarah had developed our composting program, which had reduced waste by 60%. Tom had created playlist algorithms that perfectly matched customer energy levels to time of day. Their contributions were valued, recognized, rewarded with bonuses and growth opportunities. "Riley," Sarah said as she tied on her apron, "that sustainability consultant you connected us with? She wants to feature our waste reduction program in her next article for Food and Wine magazine." I felt a familiar surge of pride. Food and Wine. Not exactly the business publication I'd imagined being featured in when I was dreaming of consulting success, but recognition nonetheless. That's amazing. Make sure to mention the team effort. This wasn't just company policy. It was your innovation. Quote, ... As I drove to the Fremont location for my next check-in, I thought about the irony of my situation. Here I was, implementing sustainable business practices, developing innovative operational systems, building meaningful partnerships with suppliers and community organizations, all the things I'd hoped to do as a consultant. But because it was happening in coffee shops instead of corporate boardrooms, my family saw it as failure. The Fremont location was our newest and most challenging. Located in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, we'd had to navigate complex community relations, balancing the needs of longtime residents with the expectations of newcomers. It had required diplomatic skills I'd never learned in business school, the ability to build trust across cultural and economic divides. When I walked in, I found Priya, the location manager, deep in conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who'd become one of our most vocal community advocates. "Riley," Mrs. Rodriguez called out when she saw me. "Perfect timing. I was just telling Priya about the community center's fundraiser next month. We're hoping Brew and Bean might donate coffee for the event. 6 months ago, I would have seen this as a distraction from core business operations. Now I understood that community engagement was essential to sustainable success. Of course, let's talk about what you need." We spent 20 minutes planning the donation, discussing logistics, exploring ways to make the event mutually beneficial. Mrs. Rodriguez was a retired teacher with decades of community organizing experience, and I'd learned more about stakeholder management from her than from any business school case study. After she left, Priya pulled me aside. "There's something else. That reporter from Seattle Times called again. She wants to do a feature on our community engagement model." The Seattle Times. A real newspaper, not just a trade publication. I felt that familiar flutter of excitement mixed with anxiety. Recognition was gratifying, but it also meant exposure, questions about my background, potential discovery by people who knew my family's expectations for my career. Did she say what angle she's taking? Something about innovative business models that prioritize community development over pure profit maximization. She mentioned you specifically. Wanted to interview you about the operational strategy. I nodded, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. "Set it up. We should share what we're learning." By 10 a.m., I was at the University District location, our original and most established shop. This was where Mrs. Chen spent most of her time, working from a small office in the back that somehow managed to be both cluttered and perfectly organized. "Riley," she called when she heard me come in. "Perfect timing. Can you join me for a few minutes?" Her office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd built a business from scratch. Photos of coffee farms, awards from community organizations, stacks of papers that represented years of relationship building and careful growth. But there were also touches that hinted at something more. A framed photo of her with a group of serious-looking business people in expensive suits, certificates from organizations I didn't recognize, books on international development, and sustainable economics. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "We need to talk about the expansion proposal." For the past month, we'd been developing a plan to open 2 new locations, one in Ballard, one in West Seattle. The numbers were solid, the market research was thorough, and I'd identified perfect sites that met our criteria for community engagement and operational efficiency. "The investors are very interested," Mrs. Chen continued, "but they want to meet with you directly. They have questions about operational scalability, about your vision for maintaining quality and community focus as we grow." Investors. Real investors with real money, wanting to discuss my vision for the business. It was the kind of meeting I dreamed of having as a consultant, the kind of high-stakes, strategic discussion that my family thought I was no longer capable of handling. "When?" I asked. "Next week, Tuesday afternoon." She paused, studying my face. "Riley, I need you to understand something. These aren't just local investors. One of them is from Chen Global Enterprises." Chen Global Enterprises. The name hit me like a physical shock. I'd heard of them, of course. One of the largest sustainable business conglomerates in the Pacific Northwest, with holdings in renewable energy, ethical manufacturing, sustainable agriculture. The kind of company that operated on a scale I could barely comprehend. Why would Chen Global be interested in a small coffee chain? I asked. Mrs. Chen smiled, but there was something in her expression I couldn't read. They're always looking for innovative operational models, businesses that prove sustainability and profitability can coexist. Your work here has attracted attention. Attention. From one of the most successful business organizations in the region. I felt a mixture of pride and terror that I couldn't quite process. There's something else, Mrs. Chen continued. The representative from Chen Global specifically requested to meet with you. They want to discuss not just the expansion, but your approach to operational management, your ideas about sustainable business development. I left the meeting feeling like I was floating somewhere between elation and panic. 6 months ago, I would have killed for this opportunity, a chance to present strategic vision to serious investors, to prove my capabilities on a stage that mattered. But now I felt the weight of everything that had happened, all the times my family had dismissed my work, all the doubts I'd internalized about my own worth. That evening, I found myself doing what I'd been avoiding for weeks, calling Jake. I needed someone to help me process what was happening, someone who understood the business world I'd once been part of. "Rye," he said, sounding genuinely pleased to hear from me. "How's it going? Mom said you're still working at the coffee place." The coffee place. Even Jake, who should have understood complexity and nuance, reduced my work to something casual and temporary. "Actually, that's why I'm calling," I said. "We're expanding. I'm meeting with investors next week, including someone from Chen Global Enterprises." There was a pause. Chen Global? Seriously? That's actually pretty impressive. What's the deal? For the next 20 minutes, I explained the expansion plans, the operational innovations we'd implemented, the community engagement model that had attracted investor attention. As I talked, I could hear Jake's tone shifting from polite interest to genuine surprise. "Wait, you developed all this yourself? The supply chain optimization, the community partnerships, the scalability framework?" "Yes," I said, hearing the defensiveness creep into my voice. "That's what operations managers do, Jake. We solve problems." "No, I know, it's just, this sounds like serious strategy work, like consultant-level thinking. Consultant-level thinking. As if the skills I developed in business school only counted when applied in certain contexts to certain types of businesses. "It is serious strategy work," I said. "It's always been serious strategy work. The difference is that instead of helping corporate clients optimize their quarterly profits, I'm helping a small business build something sustainable and meaningful." Jake was quiet for a moment. "You know what? You're right. I'm sorry. I think I've been underestimating what you're doing." It was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged that my work might actually be valuable, might actually require the skills and intelligence they'd always assumed I possessed. But instead of feeling vindicated, I felt tired. Tired of having to prove myself. Tired of justifying work that should speak for itself. "The thing is," I said, "I don't need you to understand what I'm doing. I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing." After we hung up, I sat on my couch with a cup of tea. Our new chamomile blend from a farm in Guatemala that I'd personally visited to negotiate our partnership, and tried to process everything that was happening. The investor meeting represented everything I'd thought I wanted when I was pursuing consulting jobs. High-stakes strategy discussions, significant financial decisions, the opportunity to shape the future of a growing business. But it was happening in a context my family couldn't understand or respect. I thought about the note from my mother, still tucked inside Isabella's engagement invitation. "Maybe don't mention your little coffee shop job." The casual dismissal of work that was about to be evaluated by some of the most sophisticated investors in the region. What would she say when she found out that her dead-end job daughter was presenting expansion strategies to Chen Global Enterprises? What would any of them say? But as I sat there, surrounded by the life I'd built, modest but honest, challenging but meaningful, I realized something important. I didn't need their validation anymore. I'd spent months trying to prove that my work mattered, that my choices were legitimate, that I wasn't wasting my potential. But the truth was, I'd never been more engaged, more challenged, or more proud of what I was building. Every morning, I woke up excited about the problems I'd solve, the relationships I'd develop, the impact I'd make. When was the last time Jake could say that about his work at Morrison? When was the last time my parents felt genuinely passionate about what they did for a living? My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. Forgot to mention. The Chen Global representative will be Alexander Chen himself. He specifically requested to meet you. Sleep well, Alexander Chen. The CEO himself was coming to evaluate my work, to discuss my vision for the business. I stared at the message, trying to process what this meant. Then I laughed, actually laughed out loud in my empty apartment, because the universe had just delivered the most perfect irony imaginable. Saturday night, I would go to Isabella's engagement party. My family would be there, probably preparing to make subtle comments about my career choices, offering helpful suggestions about getting back on track. They would treat me like the family disappointment, the one who'd fallen from grace and was still struggling to find her way. And they would have no idea that earlier that week, I'd presented business strategy to one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the Pacific Northwest. They wouldn't know that my little coffee shop job had attracted the attention of investors who understood the value of what I was building. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. I developed presentation materials, refined financial projections, researched Chen Global's investment philosophy and strategic priorities. It felt like preparing for the most important job interview of my life, except this time, I wasn't trying to convince someone to hire me. I was trying to convince them to bet on my vision. Tuesday afternoon arrived gray and drizzling. Typical Seattle weather that matched my nervous energy. I'd chosen my outfit carefully. Professional but not corporate. Confident but not pretentious. I wanted to look like someone who took the business seriously, without pretending to be someone I wasn't. The meeting was set for 2 p.m. at our University District location, during the afternoon lull when we could talk without interruption. I arrived early, checking everything twice. The presentation setup, the coffee selection I'd prepared, the quiet corner where we discussed the future of Brew and Bean. At exactly 2 p.m., a black sedan pulled up outside. I watched through the window as a man in his 40s stepped out, tall, composed, wearing the kind of understated expensive clothing that signaled serious wealth without showing off. This had to be Alexander Chen. But what struck me wasn't his appearance or his obvious success. It was the way he paused outside the coffee shop, looking through the window with an expression I recognized. The analytical gaze of someone who understood that every detail of a business told a story. Mrs. Chen emerged from her office, moving toward the door with a smile I'd never seen before. There was something in her demeanor, a combination of pride and anticipation, that made me wonder what she wasn't telling me about this meeting. Alexander Chen entered Brew and Bean like he belonged there, shaking hands with Mrs. Chen, nodding politely to the staff, taking in the atmosphere with the focused attention of someone who understood that business was about more than numbers on a spreadsheet. And then Mrs. Chen turned to me, her smile widening with something that looked suspiciously like mischief. "Alexander," she said, "I'd like you to meet Riley Park, our operations manager." "Riley, this is my son, Alexander Chen." Her son. The world tilted sideways as the pieces clicked into place. Mrs. Chen, the quiet, kind woman who'd hired me when no one else would, who'd trusted me with her business, who'd believed in my potential when my own family couldn't, was the mother of Alexander Chen, CEO of Chen Global Enterprises. And I'd been working for her for 6 months without having any idea. Alexander stepped forward, extending his hand with a smile that was both professional and genuinely warm. "Miss Park, I've heard extraordinary things about your work here. I think we have a lot to discuss." As I shook his hand, trying to process this revelation, I thought about Isabella's engagement party. Just 4 days away. I thought about my mother's note, about my family's shame, about all the times they'd dismissed my work as meaningless. They had no idea what was about to happen. And I couldn't wait to show them.
Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Seattle feel magical. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the navy blazer I'd chosen for Isabella's engagement party. It was the same blazer I'd worn to my interview at Morrison and Associates a lifetime ago, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, I wasn't wearing it to prove I belonged somewhere. I was wearing it because I already knew I did. The conversation with Alexander Chen had changed everything. not just because of what he'd offered, though the partnership proposal to expand Brew and Bean into a regional chain was beyond anything I'd imagined, but because of how he'd seen my work. He hadn't looked at me as someone who'd fallen from grace or was making the best of a bad situation. He'd seen someone who was building something extraordinary. Your operational innovations aren't just impressive for a small business, he'd said during our 3-hour meeting. They're revolutionary for any business. The way you've integrated sustainability with profitability, community engagement with scalability, this is the future of conscious capitalism. He'd offered me a position as Regional Development Director for Chen Global's hospitality division, overseeing the expansion of Brew and Bean and developing similar partnerships with other community-focused businesses. The salary was more than Morrison and Associates had offered. The scope was global, and my family had no idea. I drove to Isabella's party with a calm I hadn't felt in months. The venue was predictably elegant, a country club in Bellevue with manicured gardens and views of Lake Washington. Cars lined the circular drive, BMWs, Mercedeses, the occasional Tesla. The same crowd, the same expectations, the same subtle hierarchy I'd always felt on the wrong side of. But tonight, I wasn't the family disappointment sneaking in through the back door. I was someone with news that would redefine everything. Isabella greeted me at the entrance, radiant in a cream silk dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Riley, you made it. You look." She paused, studying my face. "Different. Good different. Confident." "Thanks, Izzy. Congratulations again. Where's the happy couple receiving congratulations?" She pointed toward the main dining room where Marcus was holding court, telling some story that had a group of men in expensive suits laughing appreciatively. The usual performance of success and status that had always made me feel like an outsider. I found my parents near the bar, my mother resplendent in a burgundy dress that screamed mother of successful children, my father in his standard country club uniform of navy blazer and perfectly pressed khakis. They were deep in conversation with Marcus's parents, no doubt comparing notes on their children's achievements. "Riley!" my mother called out when she spotted me. "Come meet the Wellingtons." I approached with a smile that felt more genuine than any I'd worn to a family event in months. "Mr. and Mrs. Wellington, congratulations. Marcus seems wonderful." "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Wellington said with the kind of polite warmth reserved for family members of uncertain status. "Isabella tells us you work in food service?" There it was. The question that had been lurking beneath every family interaction for the past 6 months. The gentle probe designed to confirm that yes, I was indeed the family member who'd fallen short of expectations. "I work in business operations," I said calmly. "Specifically, sustainable business development and strategic growth planning." My father's eyebrow raised slightly. Mrs. Wellington nodded politely but looked confused. My mother's smile became more strained. "That sounds very modern," Mr. Wellington said. "What kind of company?" Before I could answer, Jake appeared at my elbow, champagne flute in hand, and that big brother expression that meant he was about to rescue me from an awkward situation. "Riley's being modest," he said with a grin. "She's been doing some really interesting work with supply chain optimization and community development. Very innovative stuff." I looked at him with surprise. This was the first time he'd ever publicly acknowledged that my work might be legitimate, let alone interesting. "Oh?" Mrs. Wellington's interest sharpened. "What industry?" "Hospitality," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I work with a company that's pioneering sustainable business models in the food and beverage sector." It wasn't technically a lie. Everything I'd said was accurate. I just wasn't mentioning that the company was 3 coffee shops and that until this week I'd been making a fraction of what everyone in this room probably spent on their monthly car payments. "How fascinating!" Mr. Wellington said, "Is it a publicly traded company?" "Not yet," I said, "though we're in discussions with some major investors about expansion opportunities." Again, technically true. Alexander Chen's offer included the possibility of taking the expanded company public within 5 years, depending on how successful the regional rollout proved to be. Emma appeared beside us, looking beautiful in a rose gold dress that matched her engagement ring. "What are we talking about?" "Riley's work." My mother said with a tone that suggested the topic was best changed quickly. Oh, the coffee shop thing? Emma said brightly. That's so cool that you're still doing that. Very authentic. Authentic. Like my work was a lifestyle choice rather than a career. That's when I decided it was time. Actually, I said, loud enough for the entire group to hear, I have some news to share. This week, I accepted a position as Regional Development Director for Chen Global Enterprises. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of silence that spread outward from our small circle. Jake's champagne flute paused halfway to his lips. Chen Global? As in Alexander Chen? Yes. I'll be overseeing the expansion of sustainable hospitality ventures across the Pacific Northwest, starting with the coffee business I've been developing. My father's expression shifted from polite confusion to sharp attention. You're telling us that Alexander Chen, the billionaire Alexander Chen, hired you? Actually, I said, savoring the moment, I've been working with his family business for the past 6 months. The coffee company I've been managing, it belongs to his mother. He offered me the position after reviewing the operational improvements and growth strategies I've implemented. The silence stretched longer this time. Mrs. Wellington's eyes widened with recognition. She clearly knew exactly who Alexander Chen was and what this meant. Marcus had stopped mid-sentence in his story, apparently catching fragments of our conversation. The coffee shop, my mother said slowly, is owned by Alexander Chen's family? His mother, Linda Chen. She hired me when Morrison and Associates rescinded their offer. Turns out that rejection was the best thing that ever happened to my career. Emma was staring at me like I just announced I was secretly a superhero. Wait, so when we were making jokes about you smelling like coffee beans, you were actually working for a billionaire's family business? I was building something, I said simply. Something that attracted the attention of one of the most successful sustainable business leaders in the country. Something that's now going to be scaled regionally with my vision guiding the expansion. Jake set down his champagne flute and started laughing. Not mockingly, but with genuine amazement. Oh my God, Rye, we've been such idiots. You've been making assumptions, I corrected. The same assumptions the business world makes about work that doesn't fit traditional corporate models. Marcus had abandoned his story entirely and was walking over, drawn by the conversation. Did I hear someone mention Alexander Chen? Riley just accepted a position with Chen Global, Isabella said, her voice filled with awe. Marcus's expression shifted to something approaching respect. Seriously? That's incredible. Chen Global is legendary in sustainable business development. Their portfolio is worth billions. I know, I said calmly. I've spent the past week reviewing their expansion strategies. My parents were looking at me like they were seeing me for the first time. My mother's expression was cycling through confusion, pride, and what might have been embarrassment for the assumptions she'd made. Riley, my father said carefully, when you said you were working in food service, I was managing operations for a small business that happened to be in the food service industry. But operations management is operations management, whether you're dealing with coffee shops or consulting firms. The skills are the same. The strategic thinking is the same. The only difference is the scale and the context. Mrs. Wellington stepped forward, her entire demeanor transformed. Miss Park, I had no idea. Chen Global is one of the most respected companies in the region. What an extraordinary opportunity. It is, I agreed. And it came from taking a job that everyone told me was beneath my qualifications. I looked around the circle of faces. Family members who'd spent months pitying me, wealthy strangers who'd dismissed me, social peers who'd written me off as the cousin who couldn't quite make it in the real world. The thing is, I continued, I never needed this job to validate the work I was already doing. The work was always valuable. The impact was always real. The only thing that's changed is that now you understand it. My mother reached out and touched my arm. Sweetheart, I'm so sorry. We didn't understand. No, I said gently but firmly. You didn't trust me. There's a difference. I smiled at the group, feeling lighter than I had in months. If you'll excuse me, I think I'll get some champagne. It feels like a night for celebrating. As I walked toward the bar, I could hear the buzz of conversations starting up behind me, voices filled with amazement and what sounded like newfound respect. My phone buzzed with a text from Alexander Chen. Looking forward to our strategy meeting Monday. Welcome to the team, partner. Partner. Not employee, not hire, but partner. I ordered champagne and stood at the edge of the party, watching my family navigate this new version of me, this person who'd always existed, but whom they'd never bothered to see. The truth had been there all along. I just finally found the right moment to let it shine.